The Sasquatch research community, our community, is not really a community at all, but, as we know, a loose affiliation of factions that are often at odds with each other, sometimes viciously. Among the hundreds of groups and thousands of sincere, smart researchers working out there in the field in North America, we have actually accumulated a great deal of solid information about the species. We just haven't put together some of the final elements of the puzzle. I'm starting a new Facebook group that I encourage everyone to join if they want to contribute in a civil and respectful manner. I'd love for members of this group to all put our heads together and place on the table what we definitely know about the species, and then try to come up with some theories as to the underlying nature of Sasquatch. I mean, how are they so successful at accomplishing what they accomplish? Many people believe that this is the result of a process akin to what human beings would use, training their young to avoid us, educating their young on just how dangerous we are to them, and teaching them the various tactics and strategies for how to continue to be unharmed, uncaptured, undiscovered. I have a problem with that viewpoint in that if the fundamental method is each generation teaching the next generation how to succeed, I would think that there would be a great deal more variation in how those lessons are learned and applied in real life, and that while most of the students in this process would absorb the lessons fully and learn how to be Sasquatches in the tradition of 1,000 generations of Sasquatch before them, some would have to be bad students. It just makes sense. The very nature of instruction is that it's not perfect. And if we know one thing about Sasquatch, they're essentially perfect. Sure, they make mistakes every now and then and are caught out in the open, but they instantly correct those mistakes. They never make big mistakes, fatal mistakes, mistakes with irreversible consequences for their whole species. If in our understanding of how they do what they do, we leave their success up to a free choice to apply what they have learned from their elders, this freedom of choice would seem to me to imply that there would be some exercise of this freedom in other directions than how they've been taught. So what's an alternative version of how they do what they do? Well, we could say it's just instinct. Like all wild animals, they just avoid us because that's hardwired into their DNA. It's innate behavior, not learned behavior. I mean, a bobcat doesn't have to be trained how to avoid humans.
Bobcat. He's hiding from me. I know right where he is, though. What?
The trouble with this outlook, though, is that unlike other wild animals, in fact, unlike any other creature on Earth, they don't just avoid us. They both avoid us and interact with us in specific ways, consistently, from place to place, across the whole continent. They interact with us in strange, indirect ways, ways that we've all gradually become familiar with by studying what goes on at habituation sites. Any theory as to their nature needs to take into account this very striking double-sided behavior profile, both avoiding us and approaching us in the way that they do. I've been working on a theory for the last couple of years that I'll throw out there first, and then we can discuss as a group on Facebook other ways that we could comprehend their nature. My theory is the Sasquatch Savant theory. We already know of a condition that exhibits a cluster of very consistent traits and gifts at the level of genius. And this is the condition known as autistic savantism. An autistic savant is an individual with autism who is exceptionally gifted in a specialized field, capable of complex mental calculations, photographic memory, and displaying a high degree of visual intelligence. Now, that's just the nutshell definition, and it flows out into a great number of skills and capacities, as well as some traits that wouldn't be seen as gifts, but are associated with autism more broadly, some of which we'll get into in a moment. What I've been most struck by is that all told, these traits bear a high degree of overlap with those that we either know Sasquatch possess or that we understand they must possess in order to succeed the way they succeed. Before I go through 10 of these traits, a few last thoughts by way of introduction. We know that in our field there has been a raging debate about whether Sasquatch is an ape or a variety of human being. Either way, though, autism is part of the mix. One famous autistic writer, Dawn Prince Hughes, author of Songs of the Gorilla Nation, has even found that gorillas as a species seem to exhibit a deeply autistic nature, so much so that before she began working with them, she was never able to feel comfortable and understood by a fellow living creature. We share a common ancestor with all the great apes, and Sasquatch certainly does as well. I fall into the camp that sees them as fellow members of the genus Homo, because with the exception of hair cover and stature, they look almost exactly like us, much more than they look like chimps and gorillas. Sasquatch ancestors are most likely closely related to two of our own extinct cousins, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. By interpreting the skulls of the first, we have learned that Neanderthal brains were built for visual thinking, leaving little room for the regions that, in our own brains, equip us for sophisticated levels of social development. This same ratio, this specialization, is a hallmark of modern autism as well. Svante Pääbo, he's the one on the right, is widely recognized as the world's leading expert on ancient human DNA, human in the broadest sense, which includes our extinct cousins. He and his team have pioneered the sequencing of the Neanderthal and Denisovan genome. About the latter, he has written, "The fact that differences are seen between modern humans and Denisovans in terms of autism-linked genes is especially interesting." This is a fundamental quality of the interactions that occur between autistic and non-autistic people. Donna Williams, the autistic woman who wrote the famous memoir about her childhood, has also written an extremely rich and nuanced study of the world of the autistic person called Exposure Anxiety. In my own book, I quote her saying that when she was a child, she responded best to an underplaying of interest. My father used to call me Spook because of the way I hovered about and then disappeared when approached, like a ghost. She writes that the most effective means of turning down the invasion volume that an autistic person feels is through objects, interacting through an intermediary, which moves the focus off the person and onto the object or the issue, like a game that they're playing, so that there's not a direct confrontation. This way, communication can be practiced in digestible small doses that leave the person wanting more. At the Oklahoma habituation site, the whole family takes part. They see their visitors at night sometimes, and very fleetingly by day, but there's forest all around, and the whole point is that this species has had untold thousands of years to practice their craft, and they just don't come out in the open. They don't directly meet you. So these people use a backyard bench as a kind of focal point for a back and forth exchange of subtle gestures. They'll leave all these stuffed animals out there, and sometimes they'll be taken, borrowed, as they say, for weeks or months on end, and then returned either to the bench or up in a tree. Sometimes, too, one of these toys will just be flipped over. That's all. You might think that other animals would be possible culprits, like raccoons or something, except for the fact that this family has been able to film some of their visitors. Here you have a tall individual moving around behind the screen of trees in the backyard at night. And On one occasion, at the very edge of darkness, the woman of the house was able to take a picture of a very small visitor. I've brightened this photograph as much as possible, and we can just barely see one of the stuffed animals that is being borrowed. Many researchers throughout North America have reported this sort of indirect back and forth. I myself here at my house have played a game of moving rocks around. Sometimes there are long periods of time between incidents of changing the arrangement. But eventually, the next move takes place.
Immediate echolalia is what most people think of when they think of echolalia. It is the immediate repetition of words or short phrases by autistic people. So immediately after somebody says something to us or we hear it, we repeat it. Delayed echolalia is exactly what it sounds like. It's the repetition of words or phrases after a period of time. I see this kind of echolalia, this delayed echolalia, quite a bit in autistic teenagers and adults. An autistic person's use of delayed echolalia could very well be an attempt to communicate or to express themselves or interact. But again, like immediate echolalia, delayed echolalia is also used by autistic people just for ourselves. It can be self-stimulatory or soothing to us. It can be situational and just for fun.
At the habituation sites that the families have generously allowed me to learn from, there are reported many cases of mimicry of the human voice, in addition to a whole lot of mimicry of animals. North Carolina, they imitate my son and say, "Mom," loudly. They can sound just like him. I thought he was playing tricks until they did it when I was here alone, and then when he was with me talking to me. In Oklahoma, and keep in mind, these people did not communicate with one another. They just experienced these in an isolated manner, little knowing that others were experiencing the same thing. On many occasions, one of the kids will be outside and come running in asking, "Did you call me?" I've been working in the gardens or sitting outside and have heard a child's voice call, "Mom!" It sounds just like one of my kids. In Iowa, they mimic our voices too all the time to mess with us. The grandkids will say, "We heard you hollering for us," and I'll say, "Oh yeah?" At the first Texas site, and they imitate my mom and say, "Rachel," all the time. They will act like they are my dogs crying far away, and as soon as I get far away looking for the dogs, they say, "Rachel," back at the house, my mom's voice. Then when I get to the house, my mom's not home. And at the second Texas site, then there was the voice trick. The girls would be at school and I would hear, "Mom," from the woods, and I'd think, that couldn't be the girls because they're at school. Or they'd be at home and come inside, "What do you want?" And I'd say, "What are you talking about?"
It could be situational and just for fun.
Hey everybody, this is Brian. It's his first day drumming.
In a video 2 years ago, Morning Visits 2014, I document many hours of pretty amazing drumming that I was treated to in the ravine just 2 miles from my house. It wasn't until the next year, just last August 17th, that I finally managed to film, although very briefly, one of the longtime residents of this area. Here's some of the drumming that I recorded in that 2014 video. What happens next is a definite first for me in this project. You can be the judge whether he is clapping or clacking stones together. For this one, I'll just refer you to my YouTube video, The Sasquatch Savant Theory 2, Why All These Stick and Tree Structures. Swaying and rocking is an extremely typical autistic trait. It's in the category of what is called stimming or stimulating, self-stimulating, but in the sense of soothing oneself, getting a rhythm. Percussion is in the same vein. It's to stabilize oneself, to feel more comfortable in one's environment. And if you've read any Sasquatch sighting reports, you'll know how very common it is, too, for Sasquatch to be described as swaying back and forth behind a tree.
So I sat here and I started seeing some red eye shine, some gold eye shine back out in here, and then just below me right here, something just ran right through here really fast. And I look over this way, and just right over here, maybe 30 to 40 feet, I can see what looks like, it's totally black, it's dark, but there's like this brownish shadow that appears to be upright, and it's rocking back and forth right over here. And it's like, okay, is that really there? Is that just shadows? So I'm kind of sitting here and I'm looking around and I'm trying not to look over there, and I'm looking up at the stars and I'm kind of glancing back over there. And yeah, it's still there. And I'm looking around and I'm trying not to look over there. And every time I look back over there, it's still just right over here, just kind of rocking back and forth, rocking back and forth. And this went on for several minutes, and then finally at one point I didn't hear anything after that, but I looked over and it wasn't there anymore.
Also known in autism circles as the 1,000-yard stare. This blank face is extremely common. It feels like the person is looking right through you. And I'm sure we've all read many Sasquatch encounter reports in which the Sasquatch, too, have this kind of mask-like expression. Even way back in 1973, an early groundbreaking book by John Napier chronicles and distills hundreds of encounters. He writes, "A frequent comment is that when observed, the creature stands and stares, expressionless. They also, of course, very often just walk away from us, but keep looking back with this same type of face."
So Stephen was deaf and mute and autistic.
This is my friend Michael. For more than 20 years, he has worked in a group home with many autistic clients, both children and adults.
When I first met him, he was working on a project where he took his Legos, of which he had thousands upon thousands of Legos, everything you could think of, an entire closet full of these Legos. And he started to build the ship that he saw on the television. And so his parents put it on the television for me and paused it so that I could see it. And you looked at the ship and you looked at the screen, and it just, it was, you know, a good 2 or 3 feet of Legos. And to look at it thinking that he saw the movie once, and that's what he wanted. That's what he wanted to build. And he had that picture, like, okay. It really blows your mind. It still blows my mind when I think about it. Like, it was just phenomenal. The similarities between what was on the screen and what he had built were just exact. And for it to be exact with big square blocks, high intelligence there, you know.
Though we have never tested this in a lab, and God willing, we never will, we can only assume that Sasquatch is equipped not only with a similarly high level of visual intelligence, but also a photographic memory. They would need to memorize just about every square foot of their territory in order to know our own movements, our own changes to the environment, when we might be trying to trick them, get the jump on them. Combining this mental gift with tactical and strategic genius is the only way I can imagine that they could so masterfully, indeed infallibly, avoid being captured by us or killed. I guess I hardly need to explain that this is at the very heart of the genius of Sasquatch. It's what so thoroughly baffles the human race, those who bother to think about this phenomenon. How can they possibly be so good at hiding? Well, this is the stock and trade of autistic people as well. It seems they can't stand to be directly confronted. They use all sorts of evasion strategies, both to hide their true self and to conceal themselves physically. The way they describe it, they feel always on the brink of being invaded by chaos, and they need to maintain a guarded interior life of order and control. It's a pitched battle all the time.
I worked in a group home. It was just a regular home with, the halls were a little bit wider for wheelchairs. And I knew that this particular individual was in the house. He could only be a few places. And you had a sense that, yes, they are there. I heard him like 5 minutes ago. I know he's in here. And searched the house head to toe, and they're not in there. I mean, systematically go through each room in a clockwise fashion, knowing that there's no way, through. Could not find that individual whatsoever. I never could figure it out. He'd just end up on the couch. You'd walk out and say, I'm finished, and he'd be on the couch, or he'd be standing in the kitchen, or he'd be standing behind you.
Here we are again at this apparent paradox that they will both flee, like all other wild animals, and also make overtures toward us. They'll try to get a rise out of us. They'll try to affect us or gain some sort of leverage over us. They'll peek in the windows. They will slap the sides of our houses. They'll toss pebbles and rocks onto the roof. They'll scratch at screens with their fingernails. All sorts of other things that are guaranteed to freak us out. In Exposure Anxiety, Donna Williams describes this syndrome within the lives of autistic people. She calls it being a buzz junkie. You crave an adrenaline rush, and sometimes this rush is achieved by escaping from others, as described by Michael just now, and sometimes it's the opposite. She writes, "For not only does the adrenaline addiction provoke involuntary self-protection responses, as in escaping, but it also drives thrill-seeking behaviors and the adrenaline rush that goes with them. This manic, euphoric high is the equivalent of jumping from heights. What could be more exciting than occasionally to approach the enemy or the other, the pinnacle of danger, and actually turn the tables on them, terrify or prank them?" It's well known that autistic children and adults sometimes are forced into throwing tantrums when they feel emotionally overwhelmed. But they'll do this too when they're not overwhelmed, just for fun. Again, it's a case of asserting control over one's environment, feeling power and agency. Sasquatch certainly throw tantrums as well, as when they want to get humans out of their territory, and they will intimidate them by pushing trees over or breaking limbs or bluff charging or stamping or screaming. All of the families that generously contributed to my book, Our Life with Bigfoot, reported experiencing nights on which trees in their forest were being destroyed, nights of pandemonium when branches were being snapped and whole trees were being pushed over. And the next morning they would go check, and indeed it looked like a war zone or like a tornado had come through there. It seems that they sometimes get sheer pleasure out of testing their own power.